We are honored to welcome on stage two extraordinary visionary thought leaders changing the world. Jen Bawden, a macroeconomist, predicted the 2000 tech crash, the housing and stock market crash of 2008, and gold's rise. Jen is a popular global speaker and technology innovator who spent many years working on cures for cancer and founding cutting-edge nuclear detection technology with the Department of Energy. She was also one of the top skiers in the world. Jen will introduce and interview the current candidate for United Nations Secretary General, Vuk Jeremić.
It is my great honor to introduce one of the nicest and most brilliant minds I know, the former president of the 67th session of the United Nations, my amazing friend Vuk Jeremić. He is president of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development in Serbia. He played a leading role in steering the UN towards the establishment of the post-2015 Sustainable Development Agenda. And as president of the UN, he facilitated the adoption of the Breakthrough Arms Trade Treaty. Vuk is also the Foreign Minister of Affairs in Serbia. He has a bachelor's degree in physics from Cambridge University and a master's degree in public administration international development from Harvard Kennedy School. Vuk is a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader and was appointed to the Leadership Council of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions in 2014. And, by the way, he's one of the lead contenders for Secretary General in the next elections. Thank you, Vuk, for flying in to join us.
Am I supposed to say anything now? Right? Such an introduction. Well, most of it's true, and I really thank Jen for this kind of introduction. It's a wonderful opportunity to be with everybody, and thanks for your hospitality, including last night's. It is my pleasure to be here, but this is all to do with Jen. Jen was the person who convinced me, and I come here and I did not make a mistake. So thank you, Jen, for making this happen.
So, Vuk, we have a number of questions, and hopefully we'll get through all of our questions, as I know the audience would love to pick your brains on some of the geopolitical situations that are now upon us. The first question I have for you is, Vuk, I have been literally heartbroken with tears coming to my eyes, watching young mothers carrying children across Europe. I think most people in the audience have dealt with a 2-year-old, I know I have, and seeing these mothers with 2 kids and the fathers torn apart from them. My first question to you is, how can the European political leaders deal with this refugee crisis?
Well, first and foremost, I really think this is a very serious and deep crisis. And, for people outside Europe, some of them, they get to be a little tired from European succession of crises. Nobody can remember when was the last time when Europe wasn't in a crisis. But this one is actually very deep. It's fundamental, and it's not going to go away. I am afraid that it's going to get worse before it potentially gets better. Bad news is that there is no good solution for this. Because on one side, I don't think that anybody, at least in this part of the world, with this kind of politics and this kind of civilizational background, can deny the right of those people to save themselves and their families. So dictates that you actually have to embrace them and not turn them away. Practically speaking, also, you cannot stop people from coming. Europe is not an island. It's very difficult to stop people from coming, especially in such large numbers. On the other hand, the resources are not infinite. And what currently European leaders are doing with, just trying to divide up small numbers of refugees between the member states, I think it's just like trying to cure a very serious pneumonia with a little bit of aspirin. That problem is not going to be resolved before Europeans and the rest of the world look at the actual source crisis. And perhaps the most neuralgic part of this is Syria, but it's a much wider geography than Syria. It's actually the whole of what we call the Middle East is going through a dramatic phase of change in Syria. Perhaps just the most terrible, visible, from the humanitarian perspective, dramatic escalation of what's going on there. Now, unless this is addressed, people are going to keep coming because there is no future for them. There is no safety for them, first and foremost. But even if we manage to find a way short term to stop the killing, there's going to be no sustainable, prosperous future for most of these people. And it's very logical that they're going to try and find ways of, getting a better life. Now, the problem is that, at least from my perspective, I mean, you come from America. America's a place that was built up on migrants and hundreds of thousands and millions of them, and now this is successful. But I think that the situation in America was different. The migrants were coming to a place where, there were no social safety nets and so on and so forth, but most of the people who they were surrounded with were of equal wealth, in other words, poor. Here, we have a problem that people are coming here to relatively wealthy societies who cannot afford to extend to them social safety net, which holds a very, very serious, let's say, danger of creating a big, huge underclass that is going to become, sooner rather than later, very bitter and very frustrated, which can lead to all kinds of cultural, economic insecurity issues. So, sorry for giving such a long answer, but I think you did start off with a fundamental problem. But that's not going to go away before we, as the international community, find the strength to deal with the source. And the source is the Middle East, starting with Syria.
That leads me to my second question, which is,
I hope I didn't depress anybody.
on top of this influx, as you mentioned earlier, you alluded to the fact that there are some serious economic challenges. So what role, if any, do you feel that the US should play in helping the EU recover from their economic challenges and also helping to sort out some of the situation that we mentioned earlier with the influx of refugees?
Strategically speaking, the best thing that both the US and EU can do to each other is to reinvigorate that partnership in all spheres, including the economic sphere. So since you asked me about economics, I think that the TPIP, the Free Trade Agreement, that is currently being negotiated between the European Union and the United States is something that I believe is of vital significance for the future of the transatlantic relationship and for the future of European economy. I know that there are a number of countries of the European Union where parts of this free trade agreement are under great scrutiny or causing lots of issues and problems with regard to certain sectors. There are always going to be difficulties like that because when you're negotiating a big treaty like this, there are always going to be places where you win and places when you not necessarily win that much. But looking from the macro perspective, looking from the strategic perspective, this is probably the best thing that the US and the EU can do to each other, I'd say, to better prepare them for the challenges of the 21st century. When it comes to the financial crisis, it's very difficult for the US to, I would say, to get involved too much because fundamentally the US government and the leading European governments, starting with the German governments, took a very different view on how to deal. I think it's good that they did not, that this doesn't escalate and that the IMF is still working reasonably well despite differences in the points of view between the Europeans and Americans. But additional element which is not necessarily directly to do with the US, but it is implicitly part of the US-EU equation, is the relationship with Russia. And just purely from the economic perspective, we know that because of what's been going on for the past few years, there is a decreased level of economic engagement, let's say, between Russia and the EU. There's the sanctions that were placed on Russia and so on and so forth. Well, that is going to have consequences, economic consequences in everybody, including Europe. Perhaps in Russia more than in Europe. But I personally think that this is something that needs to be calculated, looked at very, very seriously. Now, Europe can hardly be alone in making this assessment. It'll have to come through a common approach with the United States, which is going to stay, I'd say, the key global partner and ally of Europe.
Speaking of Russia, we also have the Russian intervention in Syria. How do you feel that that is going to affect the balance of power in the region? And also, we've got the issue with America and Russia sort of trying to fight a war in the same country. That's an accident waiting to happen, some feel.
Well, the most immediate, I'd say, repercussion of the escalated Russian involvement in Syria is that if anybody thought that Assad is going to be militarily defeated quickly, that's not terribly likely after the Russian intervention. And I don't think that the military situation on the ground is going to change from that. I don't think that Assad, supported by his Russian allies and Iranian allies, I don't think that Assad can end up being a victor in this war. But I also think that it's not very easy to envisage his defeat. Now, what it means that the situation is going to continue to deteriorate. I'd say that more and more people are going to die, and more people are going to try to reach European shores as a result. It's very difficult to talk about what exactly is the deep Russian motivation. We can guesses about it, but the ground equation are going to be ISIS and Assad. And then what do you want? Which one would you prefer? I think that's going to make the West more likely to contemplate, to consider a political transition that not necessarily involves Assad's instantaneous departure, which for a couple of years now has been the declared policy. Assad must go. I can perfectly understand from the moral and from the legitimate point of view, from the point of view of legitimacy of a government that had gone out and done some very nasty things to a number of its own people. But on the other hand, saying that Assad must go is not a policy. It's a wish. It's an aspiration. It's something that you feel good about when you say it. But the policy of Syria cannot be replaced by just slogans. Assad must go. Well, if there's a military readiness to engage in ousting him, as well as political and economic readiness to do the nation building after the devastation of the last 5 years of the Syrian civil war, then fine. Then I don't think it'll be too many people who would be opposed to such a bold, visionary, comprehensive policy that would be a start of the building of a new Middle East. But I, quite frankly, Jen, don't see this happening, and especially when it comes to America. I don't see in America political appetite for another military intervention after Iraq and Afghanistan. Perhaps I'm wrong, but at least not before the next elections. I don't see this coming.
No, I think Americans are very war-weary. By the way, since we are in London, I just wanted to point out that although I do live in New York City, I am a Canadian. So I just wanted to make that clear while we're in London. I grew up singing God Save the Queen at school. Vuk, what do you feel the outcome is going to be over the next decade in the Middle East? Do you see war? Do you see peace, or both? And what do you think these new alliances will look like?
Well, I didn't know that we're going to have another 2 hours.
In 3 minutes. In 3 or 4 minutes.
Well, I think what's obvious is that the framework, the system, the order, in a way, in the Middle East that was more or less kept for about a century. And that was based on the old British Anglo-French deal in 1916 has come to an end, and we can debate what brought it down. Was it American involvement and intervention after 9/11, or was it Arab Spring, or was it a bit of both and other things? What's definitely true is that this order, and I think it is going to open a new era of rivalry, in a way, almost a mini Cold War in the Middle East, but between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the consequences of this, they are going to be felt throughout the Middle East. Now, is that good news or bad news? Well, that's, I think, too early to say. Back then, I wrote a piece on the Iran deal, and I have my views on the Iran deal. I don't think it's a great deal. I'm equally not sure as to what else could have happened in order to prevent escalation leading to an immediate hot war between Israel and Iran. But this is what we have, and I think we ought to stick with it, and I think we need to make sure that at least there is no escalation or hot war in the coming years. We need to start by Syria. We need to stop killings in Syria. There is going to be no perfect outcome of any kind of negotiation in Syria. I think people should try and remember a much smaller, yet very tragic, for those of us who come from the Balkans, at least, the war in Bosnia. It was exactly 20 years ago that we stopped the war in Bosnia by means of a Dayton Peace Treaty. Dayton, Ohio was a place in America where they signed the peace. And that wasn't perfect. And even today, Bosnia suffers from imperfections that were enshrined in the peace deal of Dayton of 1995, but the killing stopped. And I think that similar approach ought to be taken towards Syria. Killings must stop, and then start building peace. But the peace is going to be colored by a big rivalry, which I don't think is going to go away. And that's the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
When you mention Saudi Arabia, I have to jump in and say, as somebody who loves macroeconomics, we do have a real situation that could, at some point, evolve in that the reason the US dollar is the reserve currency is because of our alliance, the US's alliance with Saudi Arabia. And should that alliance deviate in small or large ways, we could see a ripple effect, because if they were to decide to sell their oil in another currency or a basket of currencies, we would see a very sharp dollar pullback, and that really would affect things globally. But I'll move on as my own personal opinion on some of the dangers economically that could happen if we are not very careful in that region. I'd like to move to China. How do you see the evolving relationship between the US and China factor?
As a way to start answering this question, I'm just going to touch upon a thing that you said about American prominence and about the prominence of the dollar. I think it's relevant to the answer to the US-China relationship. Basically, there are three pillars of American preeminence right now, and which I think is going to last well into the 21st century, unless America decides to do a series of shootings in its own foot. One is,
Which is very possible.
which is not to be excluded as a possibility. Things happen in politics, especially in democratic politics. But the first one is the military, and the United States is the only nation in the world that is capable of projecting power, conventional military power, to any point of the globe. I'm not talking about nukes. Others do have nukes, but nuclear war, we all know what it means. It means the end of civilization. But the only country that can project power anywhere on Earth is the United States. And that's going to stay like that for a while. Second one is dollar. It is dual currency, and there's only one government that can control the printing and the usage of it. One has to be very careful with that element, and one needs to be very careful when one imposes sanctions on people.
Exactly.
So, because people may then decide to try and find other instruments, and I don't think it'd be in the interest of the United States to see a future, perhaps not near future, but even a long-term future in which dollar is not what it is right now. The third one is the control of the internet.